You woke up earlier than your parents ever had. You work longer hours. You check your phone before you open your eyes, just in case there's an email. But somehow, it's never enough. You think it's your fault. That you simply are not as skilled at managing your earnings as the previous generations. That you should have studied harder in school, saved more diligently, invested in something safer. But the real reason is much more complicated. Your efforts are not the issue. The system measuring your efforts is. For most of the human history, people worked for something. The more they worked, the more food they acquired. The more tools they built, the more trade they generated. It was simple and intuitive. Hard work translated directly into rewards. But that relationship has changed in the last 50 years. To put it another way, economists call it the productivity pay gap. It means that since the 70s, the amount of stuff produced by the American worker has skyrocketed. Factories have become more efficient. Software has taken over repetitive tasks. Millions of people produce what used to require hundreds. In other words, you are much more productive than your grandparents ever were. But wages paid to these workers did not change. Think about it for a second. You are one of the most productive workers in human history, but no matter how many hours you work, no matter how much time you sacrifice for your job, you feel like you barely make ends meet. Let's imagine two similar people working the same type of job. Let's say one was born in the 70s and the other in the 40s. Until he turns 50, the 40s-born worker keeps doing the same job, with the same results. He buys a house, saves a decent amount of money for retirement each year and, at the end of his career, finally puts that money into a pension fund. Meanwhile, the 70s-born worker does roughly the same amount of work over roughly the same period of time. He buys the same house, but he buys it on credit. He works roughly the same number of hours and manages only to save about the same amount of money as his older counterpart, only to put the hard-earned cash toward his mortgage. Even when he retires, his earnings barely change. Something has fundamentally changed between these two workers. Something caused the latter to produce far more than his father did, but, nevertheless, barely earn as much. Something that was so deeply ingrained in the workings of the economy that neither of them could control or even notice it. And that something, dear reader, was not a change in your personal skill set. To understand it, we have to briefly visit the work of the great economist John Maynard Keynes. In the 1930s, he predicted that in the 21st century, technological progress would create such abundance that we would only have to work 15 hours per week. He was right about technological progress, but did not consider that it would primarily benefit the owners of capital, not workers. This is the key to understanding the puzzle. The economic system shifted in a way that rewarded not labor but ownership. In other words, you don't get richer by working more, you get significantly richer by owning something that makes you money. The change was slow and nuanced that no one could single out the exact moment when it happened. Your grandparents were probably the first ones to feel it as manufacturing jobs began to disappear overseas. Your parents likely saw it when they had to go to work twice a day. And you, my friend, are living in the world where a good, stable job is barely enough to afford a decent apartment. Over decades, the market economy has been doing what it was designed to do, allocating resources to where they are needed most. It just so happened that the resources included workers. Milton Friedman has spent a considerable amount of time promoting the idea that the market economy is particularly good at rewarding people for their contribution to production. And he was right. But he failed to consider that labor is not the only input into production. There is capital, land, buildings, equipment, and other assets. They can be owned by people. And when their contribution to production is increased, their owners are rewarded. In other words, you are compensated for your time, while owners of buildings and equipment are compensated for their time and resources. Your time is limited. There's only so much you can squeeze in a day. But buildings and equipment don't get tired. They work 24/7 and never ask for a raise. Assets are much better at producing streams of income than humans are. Another factor in our compensation puzzle is inflation. It is often said to erode your purchasing power, but it is much more accurate to say that it redistributes wealth. The process is not direct. When new money enters an economy, it does not enter all households at once. It enters first with some people and later with others. This is precisely the insight of the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon. He noted that the new money always enters the economy with specific people before eventually getting distributed to everyone else. And until it reaches everybody, there will be people who can buy more with the same salary, and there will be people who find themselves priced out. You are much more likely to be in the latter group. A consequence of that is that the same salary can buy you much less than before. In other words, it can feel exactly like you're getting paid less than you used to. The most famous example of this phenomenon is the 2008 crisis, when the stock market collapsed but the bond market did not. The money was redistributed from one group of investors to another. Average wages barely changed throughout the crisis, but the people who owned assets saw them depreciate substantially day. On the other hand, the government was bailing out banks, not everyday Americans. Thus, the people most exposed to the crisis, everyday Americans, were robbed of an economic opportunity. That may explain why you feel like you are constantly struggling to pay rent or buy groceries when your wages are stagnant. As the crisis was winding down, central banks around the world have begun cutting interest rates to near 0%. This, too, has been disproportionately favorable to asset owners. Lower rates make bonds more attractive to investors while also allowing banks to lend money to individuals at a lower rate. Therefore, the value of the dollar increases while the purchasing power of regular Americans remains stagnant. It is the same dynamic. The money printed by the Federal Reserve did not reach everybody at once. It first went to investors and then to corporations and then to you. This is why your wages feel inadequate and why you are constantly told to budget smarter or make more money. But it doesn't account for how your income barely keeps up with inflation and why you feel like every year your money stretches further and further. Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, the pioneers of behavioral economics, have spent many years talking about the way people feel loss, much more severely than they feel gain. In other words, losing $1 feels significantly worse than gaining $1 feels good. That, paired with the gradual erosion of your purchasing power, can make things feel much worse than they actually are. It's not just the size of the loss that matters, but also the sense of deprivation that comes with it. If your rent keeps increasing while your income slowly decreases, you may feel worse than if you suddenly lost a large sum of money. The system makes sure that you lose more than you expect and feel worse than you think you should. Now, it is possible that the cause of the whole mess is entirely different. The economists have spent the last 100 years arguing about why the Great Depression happened. Most of them agree that it was partially fueled by a dramatic drop in aggregate demand. In other words, unemployment skyrocketed because people simply stopped spending money. But it was not entirely obvious why that would happen, especially given that workers' productivity keeps increasing. That is, why would someone stop working for no reason? The consensus among modern economists was that it was a result of people holding on to their wealth for too long. Put another way, the longer people hold on to their money, the less likely they are to spend it. The same dynamic was likely at play when the 2008 crisis led to a recession. People, rightfully fearful of another crash, became much more hesitant to spend money. The thing is, this perspective misses the bigger picture. It suggests that the problem was people holding on to their money, but it doesn't explain why they would have in the first place. There is no reason for an individual to hoard cash unless they feel insecure about their financial future. This gets us back to the topic of wages. If you feel that your personal finances are unstable, it may be a direct result of earning less than you feel you deserve, and that can create a feedback loop wherein the threat of financial instability causes you to make worse financial decisions. It is entirely reasonable to think that people would behave differently if the threat of financial instability did not exist. So let's talk about how financial stability is achieved in the first place. As mentioned above, you can either make money by working for someone else, or you can make money by owning something that makes money. The former is much more susceptible to the forces of inflation, while the latter continues to generate income regardless of the state of the economy. But how exactly should an average person go about building a stable, predictable stream of income? Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing and mentor to Warren Buffett, dedicated his life to studying how people amassed wealth. He found that the tried and true method of gradually purchasing stock in companies has a much better chance of paying off in the long run than almost any other investment strategy. The most interesting part about his approach is that it is available to virtually anyone with access to financial markets. It is not limited to hedge fund managers buying shares in obscure equities. It can be as simple as regularly buying small amounts of stock in a company you believe in. Financial education rarely talks about the importance of owning something that generates steady income. It focuses on how you should save more and spend less. But it fails to recognize that you may never truly be able to save more if your wages fail to keep up with inflation. You were taught to be a worker all your life. Few people are ever taught that building wealth requires becoming an owner. That does not mean you should quit your job. It means you should recognize that the time you spend at your job is not necessarily being rewarded in a way that reflects your effort. If a large portion of your earnings is eaten up by rent and taxes, you may want to consider ways to stabilize your financial future. You can do that by becoming an owner in something you believe in, a company, an index fund, or even a piece of land. It all depends on your personal preference and risk tolerance. The point is, your financial struggles are likely rooted in the same mechanism that has made billionaires out of ordinary people. You are steadily working for something, while the people in power steadily acquire something that makes them money. And the system was designed that way,